A quarter century of oppression. Today marks the 25th anniversary of a peaceful appeal to the Chinese Communist Party. The regime twisted the events of that day to try to legitimize a brutal persecution of Falun Gong practitioners around the world. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual practice that teaches slow-moving energy exercises and moral improvement. To reflect on the April 25th appeal and its significance, earlier we spoke with Levi Browde, Executive Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. Levi Browde, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Levi, to begin, what led to these 10,000 practitioners of Falun Gong gathering that day? What were the events ahead of this?
Well, I think that's an important question because that's where a lot of people get things wrong. I mean, the common narrative that it was rather a sudden event that was kind of surrounding the government central compound there in Beijing, and that's wrong on several different fronts. And the first thing to understand is the background of what was happening in the time leading up to that. And I think there's 2 points to make there. One is to understand that, you know, back in the 90s, in this time, throughout the 90s, actually, Falun Gong was widely popular, supported by the government. It was sort of everywhere in China. But the CCP is not necessarily a monolith. And so as Falun Gong's popularity was really growing, its main book was a bestseller in 1996, there were factions within the CCP that did start to attack Falun Gong in news articles, open up investigations where, and it's clearly, if you look at the record, it's clear that they had come up with a conclusion, let's find something wrong with Falun Gong, and then they'd start the investigation. And so these kind of things were happening as early as the latter part of 1996 and sort of going on in 97, 98. And so by the time we get to the spring of 1999, in the nearby city of Tianjin, another one of these articles, kind of attacking Falun Gong in sort of a political way, was published on April 11th. And so, as some Falun Gong practitioners had been doing to previously attack articles in China of the last few years, they went to Tianjin. But what was different this time is that those practitioners were beaten, they were thrown in prison. That was something that was new. That had never happened before. And so a lot of the Falun Gong practitioners in the area became concerned. They wanted to go to Tianjin and talk to the paper and trying to figure out what the misunderstanding was. And they were told by government officials, no, don't come to Tianjin. Go to the appeals office in Beijing. And so that's a key thing that most people miss. There were factions within the CCP that were telling the Falun Gong practitioners, go to Beijing, go to Beijing. And so on April 25th, the word got around, and you have actually more than 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners going to the appeals office, which is the normal place that you go to when you have a grievance with the government. It happens to be adjacent to Zhongnanhai, the central leadership of the Communist Party. And so that's really how this event unfolded. It had a background in this kind of negativity that some of these factions were doing for a few years. And essentially, Falun Gong was told to go to Beijing on that day.
Now, jumping out a bit, what is the significance of this day, April 25th, to Americans? Why should we care here?
Two points. One is the CCP. I think what really comes out of April 25th is the idea that, you know, at least factions within the CCP pretty much orchestrated this event. You know, again, as they've been doing investigations, it was sort of the latest in an effort to try and provoke Falun Gong, in trying to create an event where they can go after Falun Gong. And so it was a real lesson in terms of the nature of the CCP and some of the conniving that they do and some of the backroom politicking they do when there's factions that want to secure power. And a lot of the persecution of Falun Gong, tragically, is really about a faction within the CCP trying to secure power. So that's one lesson. I think the other lesson to really learn is to understand what Falun Gong was really doing on that day. This was not a besieging of the compound, as the CCP says, and it wasn't even a protest, as a lot of the Western media had portrayed it. It really was Falun Gong practitioners thinking this whole thing was a big misunderstanding, because the only way they could conceive of the Chinese regime doing something negative to them is just they didn't understand them. And so this whole thing was a very peaceful attempt just to go to the appeals office to explain themselves. And I think that shows a lot about where Falun Gong was coming from.
Now, you mentioned the persecution against the Falun Gong, and many see this day, April 25th, as kind of setting the stage for the persecution that came following that. What has that persecution looked like since then?
Well, starting in July, really July 20th, the early morning hours of July 20th of 1999, the CCP unleashed a violent nationwide campaign to completely eradicate Falun Gong, in their own words, eradicate Falun Gong. And that has meant, at this point, over the last 25 years, millions of Falun Gong practitioners detained or imprisoned throughout China. We know of over 5,000 people that have been killed from torture, and those are just a few that we've been able to verify the details of. And according to the China Tribunal that convened in London a few years ago, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, have been killed to extract their organs and fuel the forced organ harvesting business. And so the impact it's hard to overstate in terms of the amount of suffering that has unveiled, the tearing apart of families and communities for the last quarter century.
On that note, what does this day, April 25th, signify to the Falun Gong practitioners, especially those around the world who are able to either rally or stand up for their faith without ending up in jail like they would in China?
I think for many it's an emotional day, because it was the first time that Falun Gong practitioners, even under the threat that we had talked about that was happening during the spring of 1999, came forth and just on their faith and their conviction that what they were doing was right, stand up and willing to engage with the Chinese regime and trying to explain themselves. There was I think that's something very precious among the Falun Gong community that looks at that as that set the tone for not only what was happening in China, but worldwide, on peacefully appealing not only initially to the Chinese regime, eventually to the international community, to let them know what we were all about and how horrific this persecution is. That was really the start. That was the first event that really started that. And so it really is the catalyst for all of the peaceful civil disobedience that has since taken place inside China and the peaceful demonstrations that have been going on around the world.
Levi Browde, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany.